Jack. We're going to be asking you today some questions about your history in behavior analysis and your experiences throughout your career in behavior analysis. Our first question is, what events led you to become a behavior analyst?
Well, they were kind of peculiar in a way. I went to UCLA and I did undergraduate and graduate work at UCLA. In the undergraduate program at UCLA, there was no behavior analysis. There was just a course on learning, and a typical learning theory course. And in that course, for about maybe 3 weeks, we considered learning theory, and we had Hull and Skinner and Tolman and that kind of stuff. And so, and there was no behavior analysis in it. And I had no interest in behavior analysis. I was primarily interested in physiological psych and in statistics. Those were the two main areas that I was studying. My doctoral advisor was Donald B. Lindsley, not Ogden, but Donald Lindsley, and he was a physiological psychologist. And I had others interest in experimental psych, but none of it was behavior analysis. When I went to Kansas, University of Kansas, there was a course that no one liked to teach. It was a course on psychology, introductory psychology, for non-majors. And no one liked to teach that class. They all wanted to teach the class for majors. And they didn't want to really, when they got right down to it, they didn't want to teach much anyway. They wanted to do their research. So the new arrival always got assigned that class. And so my approach to teaching at that time, I had no college instructional technology or anything. My approach to teaching was to look through my own library. I liked books, and I had a lot of books. And so my approach was to, I used the standard textbook that they had assigned, and when I got to the section that I was going to have to teach next, I would look through my own library and see what I had that I could add something to. In other words, what I wanted to do was, I wanted the students to realize that I was not just duplicating what was in their textbook. I wanted to give a little something extra. Why was I being paid, So I started looking through my library to see, we were coming up to the section on learning. And so I looked through my library, and just by chance, I had purchased Science and Human Behavior. I was a veteran, so I had the GI Bill, so I didn't have to buy books. And so I got the books free from the GI Bill, and when you dropped a course, you were supposed to give the books back, but they never really insisted on that. So I had purchased a book on Science and Human Behavior for a course I was going to take, which I then dropped and never did take the course. I mean, I didn't take the course at all while I was at UCLA, but I kept the book. And so one early morning, I guess, 6 o'clock, something like that, I started looking through my library to see what I could say about learning. And I picked up the Skinner Science and Human Behavior, and I started looking at the first chapter, the one about that's the philosophy of science kind of chapter. And then I started reading further into it, and by the time I was well into it, 3 or 4 chapters, it was sort of an epiphany. It was like a religious experience. It was sort of like I could see then that was right. It was quite clear that he was right, and that's what I wanted to do. That's the way I wanted to. It was clear to me that that's what I wanted to do the rest of my life, was pursue that particular approach, which is what I did. Now at Kansas, I sort of became a behavior analyst that first night, and a couple days later, and so I was the same age as many of the graduate students. They had come from Brooklyn. Many of them were psychoanalytic in their orientation, and I was their same age, and my wife at that time, my first wife at that time, and I used to go out dancing with them, and so we were, all of the rest of the faculty were much older, the cognitive, Levinian type cognitive psychologists, and they did not interact with the students on an egalitarian basis at all. And so, as soon as I began to get to know the graduate students, they all wanted to convince me or explain to me why Skinner's approach was too narrow and was inappropriate in many respects, and really couldn't answer some of the real basic questions in behavior analysis. And so I would say, oh, okay, what are these basic questions? So they would tell me what the basic questions are. I'd say, well, here, I can answer that question. I'll be happy to answer that question. And I would tell them and I would say, here's what Skinner would say. And of course, at that time, he was alive then, so he could have contradicted me, but probably wouldn't have, because it was always very positive. Here's what Skinner would say about that, and I would say what Skinner would say, and they would try to argue against it, but the facts are they couldn't win any of the arguments. Skinner's arguments were much better. They didn't have any adequate arguments, and so, in a sense, I became a dedicated Skinnerian, and it was causing a lot of trouble in the department. It was causing, in the sense that now the faculty who had long been able to carp on how behaviorism couldn't do anything, now the students were contradicting him, and I was contradicting them. So eventually the chair of the department called me in, and he said that after I'd been there for 1 full year, and we're coming up for rehiring at the second year, he called me in and he said, Jack, we really admire the work you're doing, and they'd hired me there to teach statistics and physiological psych, which I was doing very much to there, and also philosophy of science. He said, we admire your work very much, we want you to continue it, but the facts are you cannot have a home here at KU. We are trying to develop a Levinian cognitive psychology program, and what you're doing does not contribute to that at all. So we want you to get another job, but we don't want you to take an unsatisfactory job. What we want you to do is to you stay here until you get a better job. You don't have to leave until you get a better job, but as soon as you get a better job, then you should take it, and vaya con Dios. And so I didn't know at the time that they immediately set about to try to find me a better job. They immediately made contact with all of their colleagues, and it turns out that one of their colleagues, who had been at Kansas University, Lee Meyerson, had been at Kansas University, and they had not hired him because they could not believe that a deaf person could conduct classes. Even though Lee read lips very well and so forth, still they just couldn't believe that a deaf person could conduct a class. The deaf person would not understand what was going on, could not communicate, and so forth. So they refused to hire him there, and so he was looking for a job, and he had gone to the University of Houston, where they had hired. At the University of Houston, had no great interest in Levine or anything of that sort, but they were very open-minded, and they wanted a person who had publications. And Lee had publications, and Lee was well known in his field in many respects. So they wanted him because of that, and so he went there, and then 2 years later, he hired me to come there. And I went there, and it was very enjoyable in the sense that he and I were the only bachelors at that time, and we often were in the building late in the evenings. I didn't have to go home for any particular reason, and so I would often stay there and work. And it was a nice place to work, and it was air conditioned, and so I would stay at the lab and work. And then Lee and I started talking with each other a lot, and mainly what he wanted to do was, he didn't believe in behavior analysis had any great value, but he liked me, and he wanted to see how I could actually believe in it. And if I could believe in it, well, he wanted to understand that. And, if I was a good guy and I believed in this, well, what did that mean? So we would argue. And he started one of the most important arguments by saying it turned out there was a problem he was interested in. It turns out that there are the number of hearing disabled or deaf children who are also who are also, the number of deaf children who were also mentally retarded was smaller than the number of deaf normal children. Now, that doesn't make much sense. All it really amounted to was that when the typical way they gave hearing tests was they would put earphones on the kid, and they would say, hold your finger, raise your finger when you hear the tone, and put your finger down when you don't hear the tone. Now, you take the ordinary severely or moderately retarded kid, and you say something like that, and you put the earphones on, he takes the earphones out, throws them on the floor, and the notion that a kid like that could understand raise your finger when you hear the tone, I mean, you know, they don't even know what the tone is. They don't have any verbal behavior of that sort. So they end up recording the kid as not having any hearing loss. Because with the hearing loss test that they use, they didn't register any hearing loss, so they show no hearing loss. Well, so we said, okay, if you're so smart, how would you test these kids? Their hearing. And he said, and remember, no shocks, no cold water, nothing like that. You can't be mean to them. But how could you test them using something that they liked? And I said, no question, no problem. It turned out that Blau, Don Blau, had just published a terrific article on testing the absolute threshold, absolute visual threshold with pigeons. It's a terrific article in which the pigeons were taught to peck one disc. They pecked the disc, and there were two discs. One was above the other one. They would peck the top disc when they could hear the sound, and when they could when they could hear the absolute threshold sound, and then when they and they would get food reinforcement for doing that. And then when they couldn't hear it anymore, they'd switch to the bottom disc, and they would get food reinforcement for pecking the bottom disc when they could hear the sound, but not when they couldn't hear it. And so, I mean, not when they couldn't hear it, and so forth. So they would simply switch back and forth like this. And when they switched, they were using a Beckersy audiometer, and the audiometer simply traced the absolute value of the sound. So the audiometer, what you'd see on the paper would be a value, and then it would go down, and then it would come back up, and it'd go back down, come back up. And so it would trace its own, the absolute threshold would be traced on the paper, and you could simply read the absolute threshold off the paper, and it was terrific. Well, he'd done that with pigeons and the absolute visual threshold, and so I said, here's what we'll do. We'll do it this way. And I said, but it's going to take a little money to do this because you need the equipment. We have to get a Beckersy audiometer, and we have to get some programming equipment. You know, and at that time, I thought it's probably going to cost about $300 or $400 to get programming equipment to do this. And Myerson says, no problem, we'll get a grant. And he was very good at writing grants. So he simply immediately wrote a grant to the Office of Rehabilitation, ONR, Rehabilitation. And they liked the idea and immediately awarded the grant. And we got travel money, and we went to Harvard and visited Skinner in his laboratory, and talked with him about it, and so on. So those are the variables that got me to be a behavior analyst, and my training as a behavior analyst simply consisted in interacting with Skinner and so on.
What was it like, Jack, to be a behavior analyst in those early years? What was the context for being a behavior analyst?
Well, in many respects, and the context I should give is the one at the University of Houston. When I left Kansas and went to the University of Houston, I had by that time become a dedicated Skinnerian. And a group of graduate students, I recruited a bunch of graduate students. I was argumentative, and I was fun to talk to, and I went out dancing. And, for example, Ted Ione was there, and Mont Wolfe, and a woman named Pat Cork, and John Mabry, and they were all there, and they'd come to study with me. They were at the University of Houston, but I kind of recruited them into my program from among the other programs. I would go to I'd go to the classes and tell them what I was doing and give a talk in the class, and then the students that sounded interesting to them, so they'd come to the class. And so, in a sense, our attitude was that at that time, a lot of psychologists who were behavioral really didn't. Their attitude was, well, we have to do this with humans to see whether it really works. We have to do research with humans. So we're going to do some studies, and just like Hullian psychologists, it would be premature to actually assume that this would have any effect. So we got to do some basic research on it. Well, my students, the ones I mentioned, and we had no question in the mind whether it would work. It never occurred to us that it wouldn't work. The basic idea was that if reinforcement can strengthen key pecking in a pigeon, well, it can strengthen anything, any behavior you want in a human. There's no problem. Any behavior you can name, so long as the organism can do it, and so long as you can get a good reinforcer. I mean, you can't have the organism do something that the physical system would not tolerate, but so long as you can find a reinforcer, we can reinforce any behavior. We never had any hesitation of that notion. And so, in a sense, we were not concerned to try to prove that something would work. We just were doing it to show that the system was effective. So, for example, one of the first little projects we did, we went to the nursery school. They had a nursery school that were for the children, mainly for the children of the faculty, so they would be on campus. And so we went to the nursery school and we asked the nursery school teacher if there was is there anything we could help them with? They said, we're behavioral psychologists, and we would like to do something that would be useful for you. We don't want to study things for basic research purposes. We simply want to do something that's practically valuable for you. And is there anything you'd like us to do? And the nursery school teacher said, well, there is one thing, and it's kind of odd. He said, but we have a little girl who won't color. We have a coloring workbook, and we give her the workbook, and she cries. She yells and screams and has a temper tantrum, and so when we try to get her to color, we've urged her to do it, typical behavioral approach, urged her. We've pointed out the importance of coloring for long-term and short-term benefits to her, and so on. And so she won't color at all. You suppose you could get her to color in the workbook? And Ted and I were interacting with her, and we said, of course, we'll get her to color, no problem. We'll use the color. What we need is this. All we need is a little tin can, a little cup, and we need some candy that we can put in the cup. In those days, there was no concern for their teeth. And so we said, we'll buy the candy, and you give us a little cup. And so they got the cup right away, and they had candy there. And so we started reinforcing her. What Ted did was very straightforward. Ted sat down next to her and didn't even touch the coloring book. No effort to mess with the coloring book at all. Just sat down next to her, and every once in a while, he'd drop a piece of candy in her cup. And of course, she found that interesting. I mean, she would perk up and she'd eat the candy. We made sure that it was candy that she could eat, and we asked her mother what particular kind of stuff. And it actually turned out that candy wasn't as good as salty foods. She liked crackers and potato chips and things like that. So we got potato chips and put them in there. And so at the end of about an hour, she was sitting there and eating the potato chips and sitting next to Ted and looking at if she even looked at the coloring book, Ted dropped the candy the potato chips in. So before long, she was looking at the coloring book quite readily. She was staring at it, looking at it, and then the next after another session, he was required not to just look at it, but to actually touch it. And then another session, she not only had to touch it, but she had to draw it. It took about three or four half-hour sessions. And she was drawing in the coloring book just like the other kids. And of course, what always happens is the teacher, we showed her, look at, see, now she's drawing. The woman says, well, I guess maybe she wasn't as opposed to drawing as we had originally thought. Of course, that's always the answer. But that's okay. We said, that's fine. So is there anything else you'd like us to do? And so we did several projects. One of the projects, Pat Cork, one of the woman who was working with us, had a friend, a college companion, woman friend, who was working with kids who were being kept into summer school because they had not learned to read. They were kids that had to stay in summer school, and they hated it, of course. But the parents paid for their being in summer school, and the school readily accepted the money. And so they were there, and they had to be there. And the idea was, well, can you get them to learn to read? And we said, sure, we can get them to learn to read. We have to have some toys, and we're going to give them the toys contingent on learning to read. And because these were now normal kids, except for not being able to read, and they were, what would we say? They must have been 12 years old, maybe 13, something like that, 12 or 13-year-old kids. And so we knew that we could not find a reinforcer that would work for any one kid. I mean, what one kid wanted, another kid might not. So we got toys, and we had a system whereby, a token system, whereby what we would give them for learning to read was a token, and then they could exchange the token for whatever toy they happened to want at the end of the day. So they would stay there and give them tokens. The tokens would keep them working, and then at the end of the day, they would exchange their tokens for the toy that they happened to want. Well, it worked very well. It turned out that the reading program didn't teach them to read very well. We could keep them working at the program, and they'd work it like crazy, but then at the end of the day, when we tested their reading skills, they still couldn't read very well. Well, that didn't bother us. We didn't think of it as research. We thought of it as just showing people that our system was good. And so we were very happy that we could get these people to work on the reading program, and that proved it to us. We didn't try to publish it or anything. We didn't think of it as research. And we continued to do studies of that sort, in which we would find something that we wanted somebody to do, and we'd show that we could get them to do it. John Mabry, one of them was kind of entertaining. The clinical psychologists couldn't get the people to learn the Rorschach scoring system. I don't know whether you know anything about Rorschach scoring, but it's not like just counting the number of ink blots or something like that. The scoring system involves a very complicated interpretation of a quantitative interpretation for different kinds of responses. And so the clinical students were having a hard time learning to do that. And part of it, of course, was probably the motivational variables to make them study it were not very good. So we could see that was the major problem. So we set up a system whereby if they, to the extent that they made progress in the scoring system, they got a grade on it. And the clinical psychologists really wanted them to get good grades. And so the grade was dependent upon how well they did. So we set it up and taught them to score the Rorschach appropriately by giving them a better grade if they did, and before long they were doing it very well. And again, that was interpreted by the clinical psychologists in various ways, but as far as we were concerned, it was just a little demonstration that behavior analysis worked on something that people wanted to do.
Jack, what do you consider your most important contributions to the field or the discipline of behavior analysis?
I think, in a sense, if you look at behavior analysis and what it has accomplished, I think that mainly my most important contribution was to show or to make it clear that behavior analysis could do anything you want. That you could change anybody's behavior, any kind of behavior of any kind of organism. If you could get a decent reinforcer, you could teach any organism to do any kind of behavior. You could teach an octopus. You could teach whales. You could teach horses, in a sense. And so a lot of and that was one of the main things that JAB did. The early issues of the Journal of Experimental Analysis of Behavior were essentially simply showing that any organism could be taught any behavior so long as you get a reinforcer, and many of the studies simply did that. For the octopus, for example, it turned out that there was a problem with the octopus in the sense that the octopus has a complex brain consisting of 3 different lobes that are connected with each other by big, long, thick connections. So they really are like an organism from another planet or something, like an organism that was not evolved on our planet. And so the problem was when they would grab the lever. We started off with the lever, of course. When they would grab the lever, they would simply hold on to it forever. They'd hold on to it until it broke. They would hang on to it, and they'd pull on it real tight. And so the problem was, how could you get them to press a lever? Well, we could immediately see that you had to modify the lever. So what they did, the JF people did, was they trained the octopus to stick one tentacle into a long tube. He had to stick a tentacle into the tube and push push a little platform, a little panel at the end of the tube. Well, that was no problem then because he couldn't hang on to it. He couldn't get a hold of it. So then the octopus learned, and they demonstrated fixed interval schedules and fixed ratio schedules and everything with the octopus, just like with a rat or with a pigeon. Same schedules, same general results. Extinction would take much longer if it was a variable interval schedule, and so on. So in a sense, that was the kind of thing that I was doing, just kind of proving that behavior analysis would work with any organism, with any kind of behavior, under any circumstances.
So you've been in this field for 50 years or so. How do you see that the field has changed over the course of your career?
Well, I think the main changes are in terms of the applied area. The main changes have been not in the experimental field. The experimental field has not done much different. I mean, they're still doing good work, but they have not added anything. What the real breakthroughs came in the applied area. And so, in a sense, today's behavior analysis is heavily influenced by, for example, research in autism, and heavily influenced by research in developmental disabilities. Developmental disabilities, an area that many people were not interested in, is now a very important aspect of the field. And so the thing that's really important, and another one is organizational behavior management. Those are the areas that have grown, and so in a sense it's that applied research, applied to normal individuals, applied to developmentally disabled individuals. That represents the the way today's behavior analysis differs from the earlier one.
So, is there anything that you would do differently if you had to do your career over again? And if so, what would that be?
I think I would have gotten into the applied area earlier. I continued to study, I continued to work in the basic experimental research area, and as I look back on it, I don't think my work in that area had much impact. I think that while I got students working in the basic research area, and many of them went on and had careers in that area, I don't think their careers had much impact. And I don't think my career in that sense had much impact. I think if I had to do over again, I would get immediately into the applied area. I'd probably start working immediately with the developmentally disabled, a population that nobody else wants. And also the profoundly retarded and the profoundly mentally ill. Those are the populations I would work on more. And I'd get into those areas immediately.
You may have, in a sense, answered the next question I wanted to ask, but perhaps you want to expand on that. What areas of the field would you like to see more work done in?
The future. I am somewhat disturbed by the strong motivation on the part of some psychologists to communicate more with the layperson. To make the layperson understand our work by toning down our language, by instead of talking in technical terms, talking in lay terms, and sort of persuading lay people to become interested in behavior analysis. I'm inclined to think that that's somewhat of a waste of time. I think the best bet is to continue to persuade, to interact primarily with other behavior analysts, get them involved in doing more important work, and in continuing to do the kind of stuff in the applied field that I consider so important.
If you had to predict 50 years from now what behavior analysis would be like, what do you see?
I predict it's you can predict the future from the past, and I think that behavior analysis is going to continue doing just what it's doing now, extending our knowledge to any organism under any circumstance, for any kind of behavior, and so on. There's something going to grow in that direction, extend it, to normal individuals, extend it to developmentally disabled, extend it to physically disabled individuals. Well, for example, there was a study on dealing with seizures at the conference here, and what they showed was that seizures could be reduced in frequency if you consider them simply behavior and reinforced the person for non-seizure behavior. You gave them strong reinforcers when they were not having seizures, and when they were having the seizures, you gave them nothing. And or you gave punishment when they, mild disapproval when they're not having seizures. I mean, when they're having seizures, mild disapproval or extinction, and when they were not having seizures, strong reinforcement of some sort. And sure enough, the seizures went away. Well, that seems to me like is the direction things are going to go. We're going to expand the kind of behavior being dealt with, the kind of populations that have the behavior, and so on, with an increasing expansion with normal